So there's an idea I heard recently that we can't trust the Bible, particularly the New Testament. It relied on oral tradition. It's been copied and interpreted and retranslated so many times it's like playing the telephone game. What we have now is probably entirely different from what the original was. Now, just to remind you how the telephone game works, as I'm sure you played it when you were a kid, although a lot of adults still do it today, a group of individuals line up or create a circle. The first person whispers a message into the next person's ear. That person whispers it to the next person, and so on. Of course, by the time it reaches the end, the message is usually quite distorted or completely different from what it first was. Is this really what happened with the New Testament? Is it even plausible that this could have happened? I'm going to show you why the telephone game theory really doesn't work when it comes to the New Testament. First, the gospel writers didn't write simply based on oral tradition. 2 of them were Jesus' disciples, and the other 2 were proteges of Jesus' disciples, so they received first-hand accounts of all that took place. Second, oral tradition was detailed and scrutinized. Oral tradition was passed on to groups of people, not individuals like the telephone game. They highly regarded oral tradition, perhaps even more than written record. If there was false information getting mixed into what was supposed to be historical account, it would have been criticized and corrected by the community. Keep in mind, Christians were persecuted, even killed for what they believed in. They took the truth of Jesus and the early church pretty serious. Anyone spreading false information was regarded as false teachers and heretics. Third, there were only about 20 to 30 years between the death of Jesus to when the first writings were circulating. Should we be concerned about this gap of time? Well, let me give you an example. Say I wanted to publish a biography on Nixon, who has been dead for almost 30 years. And I claimed, well, Nixon was a president. He went around healing people and performing miracles. He was assassinated but then disappeared from the morgue. What kind of response would I get? Well, first of all, it probably wouldn't even get off the ground, and I'd probably be the laughingstock of the whole country. Why? Well, first, there are people alive today that were alive when Nixon was alive. Second, there are many who know the actual record of Nixon, who he was, what he did, and what he didn't do. In fact, even if I tried writing a historical fact about someone who was alive 100 years ago, it would probably be cross-checked and corrected. Sometimes we think the first century wasn't civilized enough to scrutinize historical text, but they were pretty advanced. There were historians, scholars, judges, philosophers, and scribes who diligently copied the text. The fact that the first writings of Jesus were only 20 to 30 years after his death is actually astounding. Compared to any other figures of antiquity, none compare. In fact, we look at a lot of the famous figures we learn about in school. A lot that was written about them was after they were already dead, and much of them many, many years after. The first record of Alexander the Great was written hundreds of years after his death, and the earliest copy we have of that record is from over 900 years after he was already dead, but we seldom ever question any of the details of his life. Scholars point out that of the 10 copies of Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, the earliest is 1,000 years after his death, yet no one doubts its validity. Why? Because according to historical criteria, it's completely acceptable. And when it comes to the New Testament, according to the criteria historians and scholars use, it has overwhelming evidence of a valid historical document. 4. Much of the earliest manuscripts still exist today. See, with the telephone game, once the message is passed on to the second person, the first message is lost. When passed on to the third person, the second message is gone, and so on. But with the scriptural text, we still have the earliest manuscript and all those that came after. In fact, there's over 5,000 copies of the New Testament manuscripts that are consistent. And while skeptics are quick to note that there are 200,000 errors among these copies, they fail to mention what those actually are. The word that should be used are variants. Scholars note that a variant is counted anytime one copy is different from any other copy, and it's counted again in every copy where it appears. So when a single word is spelt differently in 3,000 copies, that's counted as 3,000 variants. In fact, there are only 10,000 places where variants occur, and most of these are matters of spelling and word order. So out of some 5,300 copies, when put next to each other, they all tell the same story. None of the variations affect the doctrine of faith. Jesus is still the same Jesus who was God incarnate. He was still crucified. He still died. And he still resurrected from the tomb. One would think that the story of Jesus being transmitted over centuries would change or get screwed up along the way. But every copy of the New Testament manuscripts that were found at different times and from different locations and in different languages all tell the same story with the same details. So, if the question is, with all the transmission and copying of the Bible over centuries, how can we be sure that what we have now is what was first written? The answer is, we still have what was first written. So if you compare your 2023 Bible to the earliest Greek text, you're still going to get the same story. Over 2,000 years and the story hasn't changed. Just because we're incapable of passing along a message around a telephone game circle doesn't mean that scholars and historians have the same problem. If we can't trust the New Testament as a valid historical document, then we can't trust any of the texts that we count on for history. Until next time.
This is the way.